What's up, guys, and welcome back to another episode of Bass Fishing Tips. And in today's video I want to talk about spinnerbaits versus chatterbaits. Now, when you look on the internet or you read articles from different bass fishing people, they'll often talk about the spinnerbait and the chatterbait as if though they're pretty much the same exact bait. And when you look at them from a 10,000 foot view, they are very similar. They both do really well in current, they do well around grass, they do well around rock, around shad, around bluegill. They catch bass in a lot of the same places, water temperatures, and times of year that each other does. And so in today's video, I really want to talk about the physical differences between a spinnerbait and a chatterbait and how those physical differences help me determine whether I pick up a spinnerbait or a chatterbait, what rod that I throw it on, and really just kind of do a deep dive into how I pick whether I pick up a spinnerbait or a chatterbait, because it's really where the rubber meets the road. When you open up your tackle box and you're in an area where you know fish are eating bait fish or bluegills or whatever it is, how do you determine whether you pick up a spinnerbait or a chatterbait? Because that determination can mean the difference between catching a lot of fish or just a few fish, or getting a lot of bites, or actually putting bites into the boat. And so without further ado, let's get into this video and let's start with the spinnerbait. Now, the spinnerbait obviously is physically very different than the chatterbait. And I think this is very important. As simple as it is, a lot of people overlook the fact that they are physically different. And so when we look at a spinnerbait, we've got a lead head with a skirt and a hook attached via a wire to a set of blades. And the blades are where the magic happens on the spinnerbait. All of the action and vibration and everything that is imparted upon the spinnerbait comes from those blades. And those blades really are awesome because with the spinnerbait, you've got so many different configurations of blades and colors and sizes and things that you can do, which makes the spinnerbait super effective in all the different scenarios that we like to fish a spinnerbait in. And the thing about where those blades are actually oriented is away from that hook. And so a lot of people will say, well, if the blades are where the magic happens, then why the heck do we not have hooks on the blades? Why do we have the hooks separated? Because that's another magical thing and really cool thing about the spinnerbait is that it does a really good job of mimicking a small, like ball or pod of bait fish. And so, bass are predators, obviously. And just like any other predator, bass will determine what they eat based on output. Like, is the output that they're going to put out equivalent to the meal that they're about to receive? And so just like any other predator, bass will oftentimes hit the thing with the path of least resistance. And so when you've got these blades up here, they're spinning and vibrating and making a bunch of action, they're up here and you've got the body of this spinnerbait down here. Oftentimes those fish will see the vibration in the flash and feel the vibration in the flash of those blades, but then they'll eat the actual skirt and where the hook is at, because they're just taking that path of least resistance and eating that thing that's the lowest and the slowest in that little pod of what they think is bait fishing is actually your spinnerbait. And so really that's the physical difference between the spinnerbait, is that you have a physical distance between where the hook and where you're actually hooking that fish and where the action is actually coming from. Another physical difference between a bladed jig and a spinnerbait is the fact that a spinnerbait stays completely in line. No matter what those blades are doing, those blades are going to be in line with the head, they're going to be in line with the wire, they're going to be in line with the hook, and they're going to be in line with the skirt. And so this is like one unified package that comes straight through the water, not vibrating side to side, not digging in because it has a lip on it. There's no side to side action, no vibration back and forth. All of that's happening within the blades, and then the skirt and the wire and everything else is just moving in a direction, which also helps in the fact that when those bass hear the vibration of the blades, feel the vibration of the blades, see the flash, and they decide to eat something, that they're coming up under and behind it and they're getting exactly where the hook needs to be at, and you're hooking those fish and you're getting them into the boat. And so that's really the big physical keys of a spinnerbait. Now, the physical keys of a chatterbait are realistically completely different. Even though they have a similar vibration and maybe a similar thump, the actual action of the bait and kind of the whole package of how the bait works is completely different. So when you look at a bladed jig, this is a Berkley slobber knocker, you've got a little snap up here in the front. That snap is connected to the blade. That blade is then connected directly to the head, and then that head is connected directly to the hook and obviously has the skirt on it. Now when you reel that bladed jig, it's going to activate that blade, and that blade is going to start vibrating back and forth, i.e. where we get the other term for a bladed jig, which is a vibrating jig. It's going to start vibrating vibrating back and forth. And as that blade vibrates back and forth, you're going to get a counter action from the entirety of the whole body of the bait. So unlike your spinnerbait, all the action comes from the blades, and then the head and the hook is separated from the actual action maker of the bait. This whole entire thing is the action maker and what the fish are actually going to eat. They're not going to just eat. When they eat, they're going to eat the skirt, the head, the blade, and everything, the trailer or whatever it is, because this does a really good job of not looking like a school of bait fish, but looking like one big bait fish. And so that's oftentimes why we run trailers, or almost all the time we run trailers on the back of our bladed jigs, is because what we're wanting this bait to look like is one big bait fish that is swimming through the water, not a school of bait fish that is actually swimming through the water. And so that's really kind of your physical difference between a spinnerbait and a chatterbait or a bladed jig, is that with your spinnerbait, you've got an action maker and then the actual thing that they're eating and getting hooked with, and whereas this is the action maker, the hook, the head, the whole entire unit is what is creating the action and the vibration and what is actually getting those fish to eat. Now, that leads me into how I determine what rod that I pick for each bait, because this is super important. Again, going back to that physical difference between a chatterbait and a spinnerbait, you have got a physical distance, again, between action maker and where you're actually hooking those fish. And so when you think about when a fish eats a spinnerbait and it's got that hook in its mouth, you've got one job for your rod to do, and that's drive a hook home. This is very similar to, say, something like flipping a jig or a Texas rig or something like that. You just want that hook to travel and to penetrate and to get a good hook into those fish and put them into the boat. And so that's why when I'm throwing a spinnerbait, I'm throwing something like a 610 medium heavy fast action rod, because the reality of this rod is I could pick this rod up and I could fish a jig on it, I could fish a Texas rig on it, anything that's got one big hook that I'm trying to drive into those fish's face. That's what I can do with this rod, and that's what I'm trying to do with my spinnerbait, because when that fish comes up, he eats it. All I want is to drive that hook home, to get that hook into those fish, and thus get that fish into the boat. And so using something like a medium heavy fast action rod is super important. Now when we talk about action, just a little caveat here so that we understand this when we go to the next rod, that fast action means that rod's going to load up a lot faster, meaning it's going to load up just a few eyes down into the blank, and then you're going to hit that backbone. And then that backbone is what's actually going to move that line, move that hook, and drive that hook in. And so the faster that you activate that backbone, the faster you're going to move your line, your bait, and your hook, and you're going to be able to get it into that fish's mouth, get that hook in there, and thus get them into the boat. And that's why we love that with things like jigs and Texas rigs and stuff like that, because that's what we're trying to do. We're just trying to drive a hook home. Now, I know what you're saying, and I know the comments are already getting going down there. Alex, when you look at a bladed jig, is it not just a jig? Do you not just got one big hook that you're trying to drive in and you're trying to drive home? And that is true, and that's why I use a medium heavy rod for my chatterbaits and for my bladed jigs, but I use a medium heavy moderate action rod. Now the reason I do that all comes down to the blade. The difference being between the spinnerbait and the chatterbait is there's no physical separation from the action maker and the hook. And so because that little action maker, that blade, is up there in the front of that bait, what I have noticed and what I have learned about fishing a bladed jig is that I actually was popping fish's mouths open with that blade when I was using a faster action rod. And I physically saw this happen. It's a story that I've told before, but I think it bears repeating. When I was first learning to fish a bladed jig way back in the day, back before it was cool to fish a bladed jig, I was fishing it on the same rod that I fished my spinnerbait on, because my thought process was one big hook, just like a jig, just drive it into their face. And what was happening is those fish would come up, they would engulf that entire bait, and I would hit them with that rod, and they would pop their mouth open. That blade would hit the back of their mouth, and pop their mouth open, and I'd jerk that bladed jig away from those fish, and I would never get a hook into them. And so I started playing around with different rods, and what I kind of started to determine was that more moderate action rod, something that's going to load up a lot slower. So with our fast action rod, obviously faster action loads up a lot quicker into that blank. It doesn't load up as far down into the blank, and so you're going to move a lot more line, move the line and the bait and the hook point a lot more when you set the hook. Whereas with your moderate action rod, it loads up a lot further down into the blank. Oftentimes it'll even load up to about down to the second guide. And so what that means is when that fish actually, you feel that bite and they bite that bait and you start to set the hook, that line and that bait isn't going to move as much forward with the hook set, which allows that blade to kind of fold forward and to kind of fold without snapping forward. And once it folds forward and you start to move that bait into those fish's mouth, and then once you get a hook going into those fish, that's where that medium heavy power of that rod comes into play, because then you're able to drive that hook in, get a good hook into those fish, and then put that fish into the boat. And so really the key differences between a chatterbait rod and a spinnerbait rod is the fact that on that chatterbait, you've got a blade in front of that bait. The action maker and the hook are one unit. And so you don't want to pop that blade up and pop that fish's mouth open and jerk that bait away from those fish. You want to pull that blade forward, start to drive that hook into those fish's face, and then once that rod completely loads up and loads into the blank, that's what's actually going to drive that hook the rest of the way home and get those fish in the boat. Whereas with your spinnerbait, again, you've got distance between the action maker and the hook, and so when they eat this, you got one job. Just get the hook into their face, and you can do that in a lot faster manner because there's really nothing that's going to pop those fish's mouth open. They're just going to eat that thing, and then you want to drive that hook straight into those fish's face, get a good hook into their face, and get them into the boat. Now, all of that being said, those physical differences that determine the difference between the baits, the rod that I choose, but also which bait that I actually choose in a given scenario to catch fish. And there's really two examples that I like to kind of lean on how I determine whether I'm picking up a spinnerbait or a chatterbait. The first one is going to be current, and the second one is going to be how the fish are actually eating it. So whenever I'm fishing current, 99% of the time I'm going to be, if I'm in heavy moving current, in situations where bass have to make a decision whether they're going to eat something or not, and I want them to eat something with a bunch of intention, I'm going to give them one object to hit. One thing to hit. Now, that's not to say that a spinnerbait can't be effective in current, because we throw spinnerbaits in current a lot and get bites, but what you'll notice a lot on Alex Rod Fishing is that we'll throw spinnerbaits in the calmer areas, the deeper pools, where there's a little bit of current, but not the faster moving current. But when we're dealing like fast moving current, runs, fishing below a dam, fishing maybe at some kind of discharge pipe or something like that, and you've got fish, they've got one chance, you got one decision they got to make. They're going to have to lash out and eat something. I want to throw something like a bladed jig. And the reason for that, again, is because it's one big target. It is, really representing one bait fish, not multiple bait fish. And if they go to eat it, they're not just going to blow through it. They're going to come up and eat the whole entire thing with intention. And so really when I'm fishing in current, 99.9% of the time I'm going to be fishing a bladed jig, because when those bass decide to eat it, oftentimes they're not just going to blow through the entirety of the bait. They're going to eat that bait with intention, and you're going to be able to put those fish into the boat. Now, all that being said, eat it with intention. Alex, what exactly do you mean? Well, that's where the second scenario comes in to play, and kind of what are the bass's temperaments? There are times that bass won't eat a spinnerbait with a bunch of intention, and that's when I actually pick up a chatterbait. So let me give you a little story. This actually just happened to me the other day, but has happened countless times throughout the past. I was actually fishing a shad spawn, and so the shad move up shallow in the spring. They spawn with each other, and when there's that many shad up shallow, the bass are soon to follow, because bass are predators. It's easy meals, and those bass just sit up there and they absolutely munch on those bait fish. And so that morning when I got to the lake, I had tied on both a chatterbait and a spinnerbait. I started my day with the spinnerbait and noticed very, very quickly that I was getting a lot of bites but not hooking a lot of fish. And what was actually happening is that those fish were just blowing through the entirety of the spinnerbait. They weren't eating it with a bunch of intention, because the spinnerbait was doing the job that it does really, really well, which was look like a small ball of bait fish. And a lot of times with largemouth and smallmouth, they're really, really effective predators, but when there's that many, shad and different things up shallow, a lot of times they'll just knock the piss out of them and then come back and eat them or addle them and then, you know, swim around and eat the bait fish that they've addled. And I really figured it out that they were doing this not only because I was getting bites and not hooking them, but when I did hook the first fish on the spinnerbait, I actually hooked it on the outside of the mouth. And so essentially what I did was that fish probably blew through the blades and just blew through that whole entire spinnerbait and had a hold of those blades. And then when I set the hook, I hooked them on the outside of the mouth, put that fish in the boat, and I started to realize, oh, these fish are just blowing through that spinnerbait and not eating it with a bunch of intention. And so I picked up the bladed jig and started throwing it, and actually went back through an area where I'd missed several bites and put bass into the boat. And so those fish, the difference between that spinnerbait being, you know, you've got that physical difference between where your action maker's at and where your hook was at with your bladed jig or your slobber knocker, your chatterbait, whatever you want to call it. Again, it's all in line. And so this package doesn't look like a school of bait fish, it looks like one big bait fish. And so those bass, instead of blowing through the blades or blowing through the entire object and missing the hook, they were coming right up behind it, eating the entirety of the bait. And then I was hooking those fish, putting them into the boat and catching fish that I was missing on the spinnerbait. Now that being said, that didn't mean that I put the spinnerbait down and put it away for the day, because what happened as the day waned on and as those shads stopped spawning and those shads started to move back off deep, and those fish didn't need to have as much intention when they were eating something, or I needed them to have intention so that I could get them hooked, I was able to then pick the spinnerbait back up and do a really good job of mimicking like those straggling bait fish that might still be up there shallow, that might still be spawning. And those bass started to eat the spinnerbait with a lot more intention because there just wasn't as many objects for them to hit. It was little isolated pods of individual bait fish that still may be straggling around. That's what this spinnerbait did a really good job of. And so the bass, instead of just blowing through the bait, started eating where that lower and slower object was with more intention. And so I put more fish into the boat. And so that being said, you've really got to let the fish tell you what they want. Both baits can be super effective in the same areas, in the same times of year, in the same water temperatures and in the same water clarities, but it all depends on what the fish are doing. Are the fish eating the bait with intention? Are they really wanting to get a hold of that lower and slower thing, and are you able to hook them and get them into the boat? Or are they just blowing through the blades and blowing through the entire object trying to kill it? And versus with a bladed jig, when you pick it up and you've got that one big object, that one big bait fish, that just larger profile overall that looks like, you know, one 3 to 5 inch bait fish that they could eat with a lot more intention. Those are really kind of the determining factors for me on whether I pick up a bladed jig or a spinnerbait, because the thing is they both do really well in current. I've caught fish in current on both of them, but again, it was all a determining factor of, you know, in that decision-making process of that fish, are they eating it with intention or are they blowing through it that determine whether I threw it in current or not. Same with dirty water, same when I'm throwing it around rocks, grass, boat docks, whatever it is, all those factors that make the bladed jig and the spinnerbait the same, that determining factor was how was the fish actually eating it, and how the fish was actually eating it determined whether I was going to pick up the slobber knocker or the old power blade spinnerbait. And if you enjoyed this video and you loved everything that we talked about in this video, make sure to click this video that's popping up right here.